a bunch of other stuff is going on economically, I think, which is pushing this kind of change. There's a bunch of stuff happening at a more sociological level. You know, you're all aware of your Facebook and your Twitter and the new technologies that are connecting people in different ways. I mean, what was the first thing, or almost the first thing, that happened in Egypt when the protests started to rise up? Do you remember what was the first thing the government did?
Shutting down the internet.
Exactly. I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it? Even kind of before you get the troops on the streets, you stop people talking to each other on the internet. And that, because that's now become a tool for change, a very important tool, as is mobile phones and texting and tweeting. So it's interesting to see that kind of global connectedness and the way technology is connecting people is bringing about big change and can bring about revolution in the case of Egypt. There's a bunch of other stuff going on here that I think is relevant. I won't go through it all, but we've got economic change, we've got sociological change happening out there. We've got a bunch of political change stuff going on too. Some of you, well, all of you probably are not old enough to remember most of this, but those of us who lived in the 1980s and beyond will remember that there's been a very big change in the way the governments are thought to function, and essentially that's been a process of taking stuff away from the state and giving it to other people to manage, or just taking it away full stop, to put it simply. And of course that, interestingly enough, is precisely what's happening with the big society agenda right now. It's about cutting back the state. So there's been a long process in politics, certainly at least in developed countries, so Europe and the USA particularly, but also Japan, of saying government needs to do less and do different things. So where I'm going with this is just to say to you, all this is creating opportunities for social enterprise, and it's making those lines that we drew and that little triangle that you pointed out a more interesting space with more opportunity for social enterprise. This kind of ended, that sort of change in government ended with a whole series of policies and agendas around what became those reinventing government. You have to go through all of those, but a revolution really in what is the role of the state, and that's carrying on today. And so what came out of that? Well, the trends that we could see in a really concrete way across those three sectors then, I mean, we can see the so-called sustainable business agenda. That's been around for 20 years now. It was called corporate social responsibility. Formerly, I don't think it's called that so much anymore, CSR. But, whatever we think about CSR, whether we think it's just a pretend marketing campaign or whether it's real, it demonstrates some of these changes, that firms are realising they have different responsibilities and the world is changing around them. Pressures to act as a corporate citizen. You've heard of the triple bottom line? Are you familiar with the triple bottom line? Anyone tell me what it is?
It's paying attention to the environment, society and profits.
Thank you. So it's saying it's not just about profit, it's about social and environmental impacts of our business, and we need to think of three bottom lines on the balance sheet or on the P&L. So all this stuff is bubbling away, is what I'm saying. And on the social side, the community side, there's been a long push towards kind of being more efficient, more effective, and actually looking for new ways of raising money. Because kind of NGOs, not-for-profit, social enterprises have been under pressure for funding. Grants are getting less. There are more social enterprises looking to try to get different kinds of support. So there's been a whole move in that sector that's also pushed towards these kind of social entrepreneurship ideas. So all that's kind of scene setting. So here's another little diagram. This is the Venn diagram. This is kind of, your triangle is a square here, or a rectangle. But it's the same kind of principle. So if you think of the three sectors we talked about, the public sector, the private, and the sort of communitarian sector, to some degree they've all been overlapping and pushing towards a new set of ideas to do with what we probably would call social enterprise, social entrepreneurship. So, just some examples, we might think of, what's happening here between the private sector and the public sector has been a long series of kind of public finance initiatives, public-private partnerships, different ways for government to talk to the private sector from the 1980s onwards. Now, some of that's also been drifting into the way the government talks to social enterprises about delivering healthcare and education and other things too. And we could look at other drivers. But I think clearly this is a stylized representation of reality, and we could criticise this, and I'm happy to do that if you like. But what I'm trying to suggest just in this setup is that there are significant changes going on in the world. They're driven by real things like population growth, like increases in inequality, like lack of resources, energy, water, food. And these kind of changes are not trivial and they're not going to go away. They're changes that are there permanently and they are going to increase in your lifetime and in my lifetime. And there's a strong argument to say that these kind of social enterprise people are going to play a role in trying to deal with this stuff. That's kind of like the sermon. And I'm not actually sure that's that controversial. I mean, I'm putting it to you in a particular way that's kind of very pro-social entrepreneurship. Other people would be less comfortable with that, but I would be surprised if we had a cross-section of people in the room from different backgrounds. I'd be surprised if many of them would say this is absolute rubbish. I think most people see some of this in their own lives. Okay, so what do we think social entrepreneurship is? I mean, one of the big questions, if you've been reading around this stuff, is this business of how do we define it? And in some senses, this is a pretty tedious conversation, but it's kind of one you have to have. I mean, what I would say is that there is no fixed. I'm not happy with any fixed definition. I think there are different definitions. I think the best you could do is set some boundaries or some sort of dotted lines around different kinds of organisations. So this is our attempt at it. We kind of see three dimensions of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, and they are there. So we see, I'll tell you what each of those mean in a minute, what we call sociality, which is something to do with the context and process and outcomes of the organisation. Innovation, that's the entrepreneurship piece. That's something new and different, change. And what we think is really important is some kind of market orientation, which is really above all about performance. It's a performance-driven view of the world. And that's not necessarily typical in kind of the social sector, right? Those of you who work in that sector will know often it has very strong values and all kinds of other really interesting and beneficial aspects to it, but performance isn't necessarily strongly prioritised. For social entrepreneurs, I think it is. So each of those, just to give you a bit more detail, what we mean by those. So the sociality piece, the first dimension, is really about these kind of identifiable features. So you're going to look at context in which an organisation operates. Is it very embedded in the community? Is it working in a political way? Is it very networked? You're going to look at the process of what it does. Is it trying to find new employment for people? Is it getting workers involved? Is it working closely with its stakeholders? Does it have a strong green focus? What's it doing? And then, of course, most importantly, what's it trying to actually achieve as an outcome? Maybe reducing, climate change problems, externalities. Finding ways of giving people opportunities to enter markets, producing better welfare products or services, and so on. So it's a kind of tick box thing, I think, where if somebody says to you, look, is this project, is this organisation social entrepreneurship or not? Well, you begin by saying, well, how social is it? What sociality does it have? And you start looking at some of these things. And if you tick some of these boxes, to me anyway, you've kind of satisfied the first boundary. I mean, it's kind of obvious at one level, but I think it's the process you have to go through. Because if you think of many firms and organisations that say, oh yeah, we're very, very social, and then you say, well, what do you actually do? And they say, we maximise our profit. We're here to make the most money we can. Well, that's nice, but that doesn't satisfy any of these boxes. That means you're probably not in this space. You might be a good company that cares about its employees or cares about the environment, but you're not social entrepreneurship, by our definition. And the second thing is kind of the entrepreneurship piece, right? So we would look for some innovation, something new. Some of you heard of Schumpeter? Anyone come across Schumpeter? Stuff. Some of you, the entrepreneurship guys, will know. This is an economist, or economist/stroke sociologist, who put forward the idea of what he called creative destruction. So the idea that to do something new, you have to destroy something old, and out of that comes all kinds of new opportunities and models. So, social entrepreneurs often have this kind of creative destruction view of the world. So they want to kind of tear up the rule book and start again. They want to say that existing systems are wrong, existing institutions don't work, stakeholders are not properly integrated in different models, and we need something new.